Hello and welcome. My name is Fran Stoddard, and you've joined the Community Matters and Citizens Institute on Rural Design webinar on Rewriting the Rural Narrative with Ben Winchester. Hi, Ben, and welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me again.
You bet. Well, we'll get to Ben's presentation in just a few minutes, but I have some short announcements. Community Matters monthly events are brought to you by the Orton Family Foundation and are an ongoing series designed to help people and their communities take charge of their futures. This webinar is also sponsored by the Citizens Institute on Rural Design. Now, this is a repeat of a webinar that was offered earlier this month. It was so popular that we had a waiting list of registrants. So Ben was good enough to offer to give the webinar again, and we have another nearly 100 registrants for this call. We'll be recording today's call so you can access it again or send it on to your friends with a link from the Community Matters website. So your colleagues need not miss out on this one. So welcome to all of you who are on the line today. We're using an Adobe Connect platform to allow us to share Ben's visuals. Be sure that you click on that link to follow along. Many of you have already sent in questions that Ben has reviewed. He thinks he'll cover most of the questions during the session, but still we'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions we may not have gotten to or new ones that come in during the program. A Q&A box will pop up on your screen for you to write in questions. And just to let you know, Ben has also shortened a presentation that I think often can take much longer than an hour. So we also honor him for trying to shorten this to about 45 minutes. If you're having any technical problems, you can dial *0 for phone issues today or email us at info@communitymatters.org. So let's get on with the webinar. Our speaker today, Ben Winchester, has been blessed with opportunities to work in and for small towns across the Midwest for over 20 years, with a focus on his home state of Minnesota. He is trained as a rural sociologist and works as a research fellow for the University of Minnesota Extension at the Center for Community Vitality. He conducts research on two topics that are vital to rural America. The first is documenting newcomers, that influx of 30 to 49-year-old people, to identify the social and economic opportunities of this particular migration. The second area involves the analysis of rural community leadership, specifically examining the community-wide requirements to keep the town running through the public sector. Overall, he works on cultivating connections between institutions of higher education and rural places by involving university faculty, staff, and students, and programs in everyday community life. Welcome, Ben, again. That is, welcome again, Ben. I'll turn it right over to you.
Oh, real good. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's certainly my pleasure to bring some of this research out to everybody in the countrysides and the cities as well across the United States here. So hopefully I won't be going too quick for you. I will tell you that I'm going to be talking a little bit quicker than I normally would be in a standard presentation that I give to accommodate time, and there'll be some slides that I might gloss over. But I want to assure you that you will be receiving a copy of this presentation for you to give yourself if you'd like to give this in your community or your county. So we'll start here today, and I think one of the key pieces that drives my research is this perception that rural areas are really in trouble, that rural areas are dying. And you look at a lot of headlines. I do a lot of media analysis, and I do a lot of, I would say, Google alerts to target when things are being talked about with regards to rural Minnesota and rural America in general. And these are just, a sampling of some of those headlines. That people keep leaving rural America. Rural Minnesota specifically is in trouble. There are some counties that they say we became a poster child for poverty. Whenever somebody wants to do a story about poor people, we're the first stop. And that rural areas continue to shrink, and that we're really playing a role in our own demise. And, I went to graduate school at the University of Missouri in rural sociology, and never once did we really talk about what is rural and, how has rural, significantly changed. We do know that a lot of these changes haven't been positive, and there are even books talking about the decline of our rural areas, that, we're fighting for this countryside. It's almost a survival technique, and that's really basically a deficit approach to describing what's going on in our small towns. And in many ways, we talk about, our churches are closing, our schools are closing. Is there a way to bring them back when actually, should we be bringing them back? Because there are obviously probably some structural reasons why we don't have those things anymore. So really, I'd like to start with an idea that a lot of what we talk about when it comes to rural demographic and economic changes is anecdotes, and that we hear about things. We see some things that are consistent. But anecdata is not really a valid source of statistical analysis. My undergrad was in math and statistics, so I love, love, love data. But as a rural sociologist, I know most people don't like data. So hopefully what I'm going to provide you here today will be consumable ways to understand rural population change in the United States. So one of the terms that some fellow evaluators have brought up is the term anecdata. And anecdata is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, but in fact it's just based on what someone thinks is true. So, and I battle this all the time. So as we go through this presentation, if you've got any questions about citations, feel free to email me. I have got a citation for pretty much everything I'll say throughout this presentation here. So really I want to talk today about what this rural narrative is, where does it come from, who propagates it, how do we, and I would consider anybody who does work in and for small towns, whether you're in higher education or the nonprofit world or otherwise, how do we utilize this narrative, and then how can we change it? And I'd be remiss as an educator if I didn't start with a history lesson. That we do know there have been significant changes that have impacted our small towns and our rural places. And we'll go back to the early 1900s here. The mechanization of agriculture really changed everything across the rural landscape, where at one time, a good 80% of the rural population was engaged in farming or farming-related activity. But as roads and transportation systems started to come about, and again, at the time, we were connected primarily by railroads, and those mitigated the placement of our small towns every 8 to 12 miles because those became optimal distance to bring agricultural products to the railroads. And then those railroads connected us with, in Minnesota anyway, connected us with Kansas City and Chicago and Minneapolis. And so really the progression of the road system, especially the interstate system in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, re-examined community life with regards to transportation systems. So now, this led to even more changes. We started to see more and more people get in education in rural areas. The GI Bill allowed people following the war to get an education, especially those in rural areas that never had an opportunity to do so before. And really the lack of agricultural jobs drove people to the cities and resulted in overall population loss as the rural areas restructured away from agriculture as a primary industry to a multiple industry basis. We also saw churches close during this time. And, in Minnesota there's a movie that was made about the closing of a church called Delafield in southern Minnesota. And of course, this is a tragic event and can have significant negative impacts on a small town when you talk about closing a church at the time. This was a mainstay in a social kind of avenue for many people in small towns, especially in monocultural small towns. Now, the 50s through the 90s saw even more changes, and some even more significant, where small town main streets that may have borne 2 grocery stores, a hardware store, a couple gas stations, and 3 or 4 bars, were restructured during this time. And again, this is a very, very kind way of saying that, your business is closed. You may have had other businesses begin to crop up, but it's really during this time that we started to see not every town could be a one-stop shop. Again, this relates to the changes in transportation systems, where people would live in one place, they would work in another. They would also start to see opportunities for medical facilities that may have been a couple towns over. So, this isn't a little house on the prairie anymore where it would take them a day to get to Mankato to get to your health care appointments. Today, we'd be able to traverse the county and even multiple counties in a short period of time. So this really restructured main streets and economies of scale economically started to play into the fact that not every town can support multiple groceries or even support a hardware store. Also during this time, we saw school consolidations, as well as hospital closings. So, the headlines are not very positive, but especially in the 50s and 60s about our small towns. But there's some context here, and that is that urban areas, we're witnessing changes too. This isn't a distinctly rural trend. But we start to see today then that this rural idyll, and this is really what the kind of the symbolic picture that people have about rural areas is still around agriculture. So as people talk about the rural economy, there are many pointers to say, well, we really need to support agriculture. Well, today agriculture is no longer the mainstay of the rural economy. There are multiple people saying this in ERS and even USDA. A lot of rural researchers will say this, but people just don't believe it. When you look at BEA data, there's a regional economic information system data that shows farm income makes up today less than 5 to 7% of any county's given income. So as we move forward in trying to understand what is rural today as opposed to what is rural as it's been defined, this becomes one of the starting points. This picture of rural, even though we may drive past corn and soybeans and wheat and whatnot in rural areas, just is not an accurate portrayal of what the bases of our small towns are. So who are you going to find in a small town when you visit a small town in the morning? And I ask this question because I had done a number of media studies looking at major metropolitan newspapers in their examination of small town and rural stories, and found out that on average, most reporters went to small towns to cover a story at 10 a.m. Now, who is going to be in town at 10 a.m.? Certainly not the people that are working full-time. Certainly not the people who may be working from a home office or telecommuting or driving to another community. So you tend to get people who are retired in the cafe. And you get quotes like you see here, that it looks like a ghost town, said Bill Gibson, the 74-year-old farmer. I sure miss the people. I'm sure you do. I'm sure community life to you has changed significantly. But when the media consistently utilizes these types of interviews to form a basis for what that narrative is about our small towns, we are completely missing the story of the nuanced changes that we've seen. So what we do know is that rural areas are changing. They're definitely not dying. And one of the key points I've got here is a lot of the changes that we've witnessed are not due to specific dynamics of small towns and rural places, but they're dynamics of globalization that impact us all. Economies of scale with regards to big box retailers and even being able to purchase products competitively on a global market does not allow for many small hardware stores, for example, to survive. So for every hardware store you hear about closing in a small town, I'm sure there is a hardware store that's closed in a major metropolitan area too. I want to say this again. Every time you hear a story about something closing in a small town, you will find that same something closing in an urban area as well. It's just that urban areas, when they close a hardware store in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, there's 5 other hardware stores within driving distance. When you close a hardware store in the small town of Hancock, Minnesota, the nearest one is now 45 miles away. So small towns really are canaries in the coal mine for understanding some of the dynamics that occur as a result of globalization and its impacts on American society. And really, the research base, the third point here, the research base does not support the notion that if something closes, that the town dies. And you can go back to when the stories are being written about churches closing, about how this was going to lead to our town becoming a ghost town. You can go back to the stories about your main streets closing, certain hardware stores or groceries closing, and that, ultimately this was going to cause a right turn into the ditch for our small town, and we're going to be closing our doors any time now. But in fact, in the past 50 years in Minnesota, for example, only 3 towns have dissolved. And the most recent town, Tenney, had a population of 6. We're not talking about a majority of our small towns here that close. These are extremely small towns that close their doors. So if there is this idea that when something closes, the town is going to die, then honestly, show me all the dead towns. Show me where they are. So this really becomes this kind of negative narrative that continues to permeate all of the discussions we have and all of the media coverage of our small towns. And so this is what I want to draw upon, is this idea that this narrative that currently dominates our discussions about small towns today is a narrative based on 1950. And it's not a narrative based on the year 2000. So hopefully what you'll find out here today will give us some information about these changes. Well, we do know, and this is related to the poll question, that since 1970, the rural population in the United States has gone up by 11%. It hasn't gone down, it has gone up. What has gone down is the relative percentage of people living in a small town. Has gone down from 26% in 1970. A full quarter of the U.S. population still lived in a rural place. But the rural percentage of people living rural went down in 2010. And that's not because rural area population went down. That went up from 53.6 million to 59.5. But what did go up is the U.S. population overall. So the U.S. population overall went up at a rate, or especially the urban areas, went up at a rate much higher than the rural population. So when the rural population goes up by 11%, but the urban population goes up by 67%, well, ultimately, that's going to lead to a decline in the relative percentage of people living in a rural area. This is not everywhere. That doesn't mean every county experiences a gain in the rural population, in their population. But what we do know is that overall in the U.S., there is still a preference by a number of people to live in rural places. And this has been going on since 1970. It's called the rural rebound, the rural renaissance. You can Google this. There's a handful. I would like to say there are hundreds of articles about this, but there aren't. There are a handful of articles that talk about this rural rebound and rural renaissance. So rural data is also impacted by the fact that there have been changes in rural America. So I would say there's a new urbanity across rural areas. So I'm sure in just about every state there are some counties that were rural 40 years ago and now are classified as an urban county. So this also impacts our rural statistics. What happens when you take a county that was, 30,000 people 50 years ago and 100,000 people today and now classified as urban, and we remove this population from the rural count? This leads to the idea that rural populations are declining in some areas when in fact they've just been reclassified. So in a way, I call it, rural areas. Some rural areas graduate to urban status. Like, if growth is our goal, they have achieved their goal. They have achieved urban status. But with urbanity comes its own handful of issues. But this also impacts other statistics such as home values and incomes. So as a county gets attributed to an urban statistic, a county that has recently become urbanized tends to be a higher income and have higher home values than the most rural counties in your community. Well, if you know anything about calculating the average of a data sample, when you remove the top end of the data, your average will go down. So we start to see headlines about the average rural home values go down by 1%. Well, when you look at some of the data, it actually went down because you lopped off the highest end of the data. It's not as though all of the rural home values suddenly declined. It is because we just removed the top end, and then our average declines. So being aware of how these statistics are used, especially by the media, is very important. So one of the statistics when I first started doing my research in the 90s was really pressing me here, and it's in any 5-year period, roughly 40 to 45% of Americans move. And here are the stats for the central U.S. and the area that I tend to do a majority of my work in. And in any 5-year period, again, we've got 41% of people in Minnesota that move. That varies, of course, by age to some extent. But the point here is that people are quite mobile and that we need to examine this mobility a bit more. So what I did was I wanted to group people by age cohorts. And this is related to school grades. So like all of these kids who were 10 to 14 years old in 1990 now got 10 years older in the year 2000. And they're going to be age 20 to 24 in 10 years. Now, if nobody ever moved in and out, we would expect those same 20 kids to be in the community 10 years later, and there would be 20 kids. But what we do know is that people move. Some of these kids are going to move out. Others are going to move in. And we need to get an idea of where those changes occur. And if you don't get this right away, I've got a couple different ways to show this. But this was the first examination I had done on this data set. And this examines, and this is EDA Region 4, this is a conglomeration of 9 counties in western Minnesota. The blue bar represents how many people we expect to have in this age cohort, so 10 to 14 years old in this age cohort. The blue bar is how big this cohort was 10 years ago when they were 0 to 4. And this is how many people we would expect to be in that age cohort if nobody ever moved in and out. The red bar is how many people we actually found to be in the region in this age cohort. So this age group from age 0 to 4 to 10 to 14 actually grew by about 2,500 young people. 15 to 19-year-olds, the red bar exceeds the blue. There are more people than we expected moving in to EDA Region 4. And again, EDA Region 4 does not have any major metropolitan areas, and this includes a few lake counties, but is mostly composed of prairie counties. At the same time, we saw points where the blue bar exceeds the red. This is the brain drain. This is where we had this many kids 10 years ago, and now we dropped off maybe 25% of them to 35% of them as they move away after high school. This is the brain drain right here. Brain drain. Now, what was interesting to me was 35 to 39, 40 to 44, 45 to 49. We had thousands of more people than we would expect to have if nobody ever moved in and out. So my key message here is people move with great frequency in the United States. And when we break these apart by age, we're starting to see a trend attributed to rural areas of people aged 30 to 49 moving into them. So I'm going to pick out one county here as an example. This is yet another way, and this is only a single county. And this is Grant County, Minnesota. When historically you look from their population in 1900 up through 2010, this one right here I keep because it's an interesting story here. From 1990 to 2000, this is how big each age cohort got over the 10-year time period. So again, 10 to 14-year-olds, they were 0 to 4 10 years ago. That cohort grew by 25%. Here's the brain drain. They're losing about Grant County, again, Prairie County, western Minnesota. They lose about 43% of their young people after high school. These are high school graduation. Because again, between the age of 10 to 14 and 20 to 24, they graduate during that time period. But then what's interesting here is 30 to 34, significant gains, almost a 50% increase in that cohort, a 25% increase in 35 to 39. So wherever the bar is exceeded on the right side is where we have more people than we expected, and where the bar goes to the left in this chart is where people net migrate out. But what's interesting here is between 1990 and 2000, their population was pretty much flat. And so what we find is, in the story of Grant County, is that we had enough people moving in to make up for the number of people moving out. And this is the general rural trend, the rural county trend, is that people migrate in age 30 to 49, and they obviously bring their kids. I mean, 10 to 14-year-olds don't migrate by themselves. So obviously they're being brought with their parents into our rural communities, and they're actually, I don't remember if I have the slide in here, we may see it, but we actually see increased school enrollments in 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grades because the newcomers, while rural populations are not having children at the rates that they once did, they are bringing children with them when they move. So the key drivers of rural population loss today are not the loss of all people across all ages. It's the low birth rate together with the loss of people as they age. Those are the two driving factors for net migration loss. So here's a general profile of a rural prairie county. And I'm not going to name the counties here because I just want to show you profiles of population changes here. Here's a rural recreational county where, again, significant population increases over the past 40 years. And those lead to pretty big increases in almost all age cohorts. The recreational counties lose their kids too. So losing your young people is the rule, not the exception. And as a rule, we find out that many communities try to counter this or make themselves feel bad. You know, there are plenty of stories out there about the brain drain and how rural communities are leading to our own demise because we're letting our kids go. Well, from a social capital perspective, the worst thing you can do is tell your kids to stay. What you can do is tell your kids they're going to have a place to come back to. Core Metropolitan County. I believe this is either Hennepin or Ramsey County, where Minneapolis-St. Paul is in the Twin Cities. And you'll see, and this is a trend for almost all core metro. This isn't suburban. This is core metro counties. The only age demographics that core metro counties gain are under the age of 30. After high school graduation and under the age of 30. This goes against the notion that all people of all ages are flocking to the metro. In fact, people move away from core metro, especially those with kids, at rates consistent in all age categories above the age of 30. This is usually quite surprising, and I like to tell this story that really it's this great interchange between urban and rural and suburban areas. So what we find then is the profile is as people age over the age of 30, they move out to the suburbs and to rural areas alike. So here is a national map of population change 2000 to 2010. Again, people generally like to use your population change, you know, the signs that go up on the outside of town, as some indicator for success. But my point is, population change is very nuanced depending upon the age groups you're looking at. And if the only thing you use is total population change, you're missing a lot of the variation within your community, and you're also missing great opportunities to bring new people to your community. But regardless, many people still use this map to identify losers and winners in rural population growth. So, and I want to focus here just a little bit, you know, the white counties are where we experience population loss. All of the gradations of gold and red are gradations of gains. So I'm interested here is where all the losses occur. You look at the Great Plains, there's some great losses from the southwestern prairie of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, all the way down through the panhandle of Texas. But when we look at the growth in just the 30 to 34 age cohort, even in communities where we experience overall population loss, there are gains of people aged 30 to 34, both in the 90s and the 2000s. And this trend has been happening since the 70s. So, again, if it feels like I'm rushing, I am. So, you know, hold your questions. If we can definitely follow up with this if you've got some clarifying questions as well. So what is this trend? The growth is primarily in the 30 to 49 age group. This in-migration into rural communities can be just about equal to that of the out-migration. And these people are bringing with their kids aged 10 to 17. And there's really this great interchange of people all across society in the United States today. So I have a colleague at the University of Nebraska, Randy Cantrell, and an extension educator, Cheryl Burkhart-Kreisel, who did some research on this. And we replicated the research in both Minnesota and Nebraska. We wanted to see if there were any general trends we could find and any specific traits that we could find of this trend. And Nebraska, if you remember the population change map back here, had some pretty significant population losses, especially in their western corridor of the state. So what we did was we focused on that western area, and we found hundreds, if not thousands, of newcomers. And we did interviews, and we did focus groups with them and asked them, you know, why did you move here? Was the basic question. Top 3 reasons that people gave to move were slower pace of life was number 1, safety and security, especially those with kids, was number 2, and the low cost of housing was number 3. Generally, they were all quality of life reasons in the top 10. A small fraction of people moved because of a job. This is quite alarming. We found many people that moved without a job and decided they would find something or make something work because quality of life is driving this migration. And this isn't like a back to the land type movement that we saw in the 70s in very small pockets. This is an overall societal trend. And what we found, the commonalities between Minnesota and Nebraska were so similar that we found this trend to be pretty consistent. We found other data from other states that reifies this data as well. So who were these newcomers? Just 36% of the newcomers lived there before. This was really surprising. We thought, you know, easily 3/4 of these newcomers to small towns were moving back. And really what we found, just 1/3 were moving back. A large majority did not even have any previous contact with that community before. And if they did, it was almost incidental. It was, oh, I went to Bible camp up by that town when I was a kid, and I kind of liked the region. So this really threw us off from our assumptions. They tend to have high bachelor's degrees at higher rates than the resident population. They tend to make more money than the resident population. And really just 51% Minnesota and 43% Nebraska had kids in their household. So more than half of the newcomers do not have kids. So these were some of the statistics that we found were very much against our assumptions, I would say. They these were the troubling aspects here. They were leaving their career. As we know, the rural economy does not mesh up well with the urban economy necessarily. I mean, it's not like we've got a huge financial services market in rural Minnesota like we do in the Twin Cities. But we did find many people that were doing contract work or 1099 work, and that's a huge opportunity. But really, quality of life was the trump card. So this trend, this movement of people was really consistent across the United States, and it was quite large. In fact, between 90 and 2000, over 2.3 million people moved from the city to the country, then vice versa. There was a net gain. Let me say it again. 2.3 million more people moved from the city to the country, then vice versa in the 90s. We don't have, that was a special analysis I've done. We don't have the numbers for the 2000s. But, you know, the 2000 trend really was similar to the 90s, but it slowed. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So really, my point here is, though, okay, you know, there's a whole book out there called Hollowing Out the Middle, which talks about the loss of our young people and the incidental actions that small towns take that lead to young people leaving. But now there's some other research out there that shows there actually are pretty good opportunities for our high school graduates in our communities. So my point here is, if we continue to label our towns brain drain towns because we're losing our young people, and again, this is the rule, not the exception. At the same time, we're bringing in people aged 30 to 49, so you're losing 18-year-olds with high school education and almost zero life experience or career experience, and you're bringing in people aged 30 to 49. Can't we call this a brain gain? And again, just counter the language a little bit, that this narrative about small towns is a so deficit approach that we didn't even see this trend occurring. And the few researchers that did see it happen just haven't been widely publicized. So it's opportunities like this presentation here today, that we can bring out some of these trends and give you the language you need to describe these occurrences across rural America. There's also really high levels of entrepreneurship and small business ownership in this cohort. So as we move forward, there are some significant economic development opportunities to be found. So what we do know is that people move all the time. You move when you graduate. You probably move to the big city. You'll meet a spouse, have a kid. You'll move again. The kid graduates. You move again. You may even move a couple times in this time frame. After the kids leave, you may move again. You may retire. You move again. You load up the house. You know, people live in multiple places in American society today. And if we recognize this, the high mobility nature of this population, there are some significant opportunities for our small towns here. So really, in my view, we've got some pretty thriving rural areas. Again, when we look more broadly at the age demographics that are coming into our small towns, these are pretty attractive demos to attract in. So, you know, my point here, again, where would we be if nobody ever moved to our small towns? So this trend has been going on since the 70s. And some back-of-the-envelope statistics I've run shows our rural population in Minnesota, if people had not been moving out, age 30 to 49 with their kids, would be anywhere between 8 and 16% lower than where they are today. It's just that, you know, the deficit approach seems to dominate the narrative, and we're always looking at out-migration rather than recognizing this high rate of migration as well as the opportunities presented by that. The Pew Research Center did a study a number of years ago, there's a citation down below, that asked people, you know, where would you like to live? And roughly 20% of the U.S. population lives in a rural area or a small town. But when they asked people, where would you like to live, 51% of Americans said they would prefer to live in a rural area or a small town. There actually is a preference for low-density living. About the only people who want to live in the core city, again, are the 18 to 29-year-olds. A very narrow demographic is captured there. So we've seen some headlines recently about millennials not wanting to live in small towns. Well, you know what? You're right. millennials want to live in the big city right now because they're young. And it's once they reach the age of 30 is when the people start second-guessing themselves and saying, I don't think this is the lifestyle for me. I'm going to move out to a suburb or rural area or small town. So there have actually just in the past number of weeks here had a lot of headlines about millennial housing preferences not being towards small towns. But again, if you understand the data I just presented here, you'll see that millennials aren't even in the key age demo that's moving out. We still have Gen Xers that are moving out to small towns. So really, I want to reframe rural migration, that there is this national societal preference to live in small towns and rural places. Not everybody is leaving small towns. We've got this kind of new urbanity that's found in formerly rural places. And I'm sure you all can recognize regional centers in your states that have risen in the rural landscape. And that really this rural gain has continued in the 2000s, but it's slowed. Fuel prices went up, mortgage prices, which tended to hunker people down. But really, when we look at the trend from the 1990s, which 1990s had the record number of people moving out to rural places, they really consumed a lot of the. Sorry, I'm just saying. Am I a bit choppy? Not terrible. I'll try to. Sorry, I didn't see the note there. So really. The trends that we had seen in the 90s were so high that they filled up a lot of the vacant housing that we found in urban or in our rural places. So really the housing that's left in many of our rural communities today may be dilapidated and would require some significant housing infrastructure investments in order to accommodate some of these newcomers. So I get asked, what can we do? And my point here is we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. And that I get asked quite a bit, like, what can we do to help capitalize on this trend? And my point here is that we really don't have a concerted effort to recruit or attract these newcomers in. But I do want to differentiate here between the two. Recruitment versus retention are two very different concepts. The first, recruitment, involves people. And so I don't want to get into an argument here about the difference between industrial recruitment as an economic development strategy and a people-based recruitment strategy because, again, in the data that we found, jobs wasn't in the top 10 for these people moving out. Jobs were a secondary aspect to the motivation for the movement. So really, if we want to recruit people, we are going to recruit our people, we need to do it regionally. We can't do a town-by-town recruitment effort. Then we're working against each other. It's got to be regional. It's got to be individualistic. People are doing it for very individualized reasons. And there are what are called people attraction strategies. And it is very customized. It is almost a one-on-one approach. And really we need to portray ourselves as being in the middle of everywhere. Again, this notion that towns are supposed to be one-stop shops went out with the 50s and 60s here. So what we do have is you may have a pool in one town. You have some really great nightclubs in another town. You've got some arts and culture aspects in another town. You've got local foods across the local landscape. That we've got a lot of things around us. People in rural areas drive. So whenever one town is pitted against another, you're doing a disservice to you both. So really, these small numbers mean big things. And my example here is like the town of Hancock, which is population of 700. Now, if we work to recruit 7 people a year, or about 2.5 households per year, that would be a 10% population growth in any 10-year time period, which, if you know anything about population growth, the growth is quite significant. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here to work on this. It just hasn't been really on the radar. So retention, then, as different from recruitment in both places. This is where places, again, matter. I don't want to say places don't matter, but we do know that when we interviewed our newcomers, they looked at anywhere between 3 to 5 towns in a 4 to 5 mile radius. So again, you want to think about this in terms of a regional aspect for recruitment, but once people find their town, we want to find ways to integrate them socially. So this doesn't mean just walking up to them and saying, hey, do you want to join the Lions Club? It actually means getting out and finding out what their interests are. And that really our traditional marketing programs struggle with the distinction between recruitment and retention, but I want to bring up this concept to you to you here today and get you to think about what the differences are between those two. So retention strategies here, we've had a great success in different communities across Minnesota with newspapers that did profiles of newcomers as a weekly event. And if you think you don't have any newcomers, go out and try to find them. I can almost guarantee you're going to find a lot of newcomers in your small towns. When we first did this project in western Minnesota, we had 5 counties, and we thought we'd be happy finding 100 newcomers in these 5 counties. Within 4 weeks, we had a list of like 480 newcomers, and that was from a snowball approach. You know, you find one, then find another, and ask around different people. So really, another real good opportunity here is just a newcomer supper, again, where you're not advertising and you're not recruiting people for your community groups. You're getting newcomers to connect with each other. And we always say this is the best $150 ever spent. And we use an ABCD, an asset-based community development approach, which is, you know, we're asking them to stand up and introduce themselves and their family. You know, who are you? Where did you come from? Why did you make the move? What do you do? What are some of your interests? Newcomers really appreciate the ability to network themselves. Don't just walk up to them and tell them they need to be a part of my group. I've got a whole other presentation that talks about ways people want to be involved today as opposed to the ways people used to be involved in our rural communities. And I don't want to run too short on time here, but the crux of this research is, historically, people would be involved in place-based groups with a wide focus. So the Hancock Community Betterment Club, and that group would do things from raise money for the school to help build the senior center to put up a playground at the school or whatnot. It was wide focused, but a narrow geography. Where today, people want to be involved in community groups that have a narrow focus and a wide geography. The West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association. These groups are the groups on the rise. In fact, in the United States, we had in the last 10 years, we had a 10% increase in population growth, but at the same time period, we had a 30% increase in the number of nonprofits. I'll say it again. We had a 10% increase in population in the past 10 years, but a 30% increase in the number of nonprofits, and that's in the U.S. In the most rural Minnesota counties, where we lost 5% of our population, there was still a 14% increase in the number of nonprofits. So that actually is a whole other presentation I've got. I could definitely get you more information on that, specific for your county, if you're interested. So there are some on-the-map strategies. How do you know, are there avenues for potential residents to learn more about the region? Again, not going website to website of each, episodic town, but is there a regional resource for our communities? And that, when the top 3 reason that people move into our small towns is housing, then maybe housing should be tied to economic development strategies. If it's not, you really, I would say, shooting yourself in the foot, in a sense. Because without housing, there's nowhere for people to move. I'm going to skip some of these. These will definitely be a part of the PowerPoint that we'll be offering up afterward here. Employment strategies. We've got a set of strategies here that are very interesting because, we found a number of people that are doing 1099 or contract work or even some salaried work for companies in another community. That can be in the metro area, it can be in just another rural community. Well, traditional economic development folks tend not to see these people. But my point is, if we've got an individual doing contract work for, say, Wells Fargo in Minneapolis, just because Wells Fargo does not have a brick-and-mortar presence in our town doesn't mean Wells Fargo doesn't have a presence in our town. They have an employee here. So there may be opportunities to approach businesses to allow their employees to telecommute from rural areas. And for us, it's from rural Minnesota. At the same time, a lot of these newcomers have come in, and their career, their skill sets just aren't being utilized. So there may be opportunities to explore more into their, what I would call, auxiliary skills, and see if we can identify opportunities to build a business or to build a network or a cluster of businesses around some of these auxiliary skill sets. And really, business succession planning becomes paramount at this point. One example we had was, a newcomer couple had moved in, and he went to work for a farmer in town, and they wanted to find a business for his wife to run in town. And they had found a flower shop, so they bought it. And we asked them, what if it was a hardware store? And they're like, well, we would have bought that then. It really didn't matter. They just knew that they wanted to invest and they wanted to own a small business. So what we did find is many of these newcomers have a high entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, honestly, even to make this move, they have to have a kind of a thread of individualistic behaviors. And it's almost, I would say, we're repopulating the Great Plains because of these newcomers. So really, migration, this narrative, these migration patterns for me just open the door to talking about this narrative, and that this narrative is so negative when it comes to our small towns that we need a better language to describe our places. So I want to give you the example here. What if we were selling in our small towns a product or a service, and all we did was talk about how, we don't have any good people working on this product. We keep losing our best people to other places. Would we allow this negative language to persist if we were actually selling a product or a service? So why do we do it? And I think part of why it's happened over the years is that we don't always look at the positives, is because, number one, the negatives have restructured our rural communities pretty significantly, but number two, you don't always get grants for things that are going great. We get grants for things that are going to help solve problems in many ways. So we do find those aspects, and honestly, I don't mean to take anything away from serious issues such as poverty or infrastructure, but at the same time, there just aren't as many positive funding sources, I would say, that allow us to capitalize upon this positive narrative. So really, in my view, rural areas have been successful. We have successfully mitigated the pretty drastic changes that occurred in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, so much so that we've currently over the past 40 years experienced an 11% population gain. So so my point here is we can't continue to portray rural success as the exception. So again, if the backdrop is negative, when good things happen, they're the exception. Like, oh, I can't believe that person started a business. But if the backdrop of the narrative is positive about small towns persisting and thriving in many ways, then the good things that we describe are the everyday. And I think this is just a significant point when it comes to understanding what we see and hear about our small towns. So then what we found is that we really just see why the rural narrative needs to be rewritten. Because honestly, even the headlines from the past 25 years are just negative about our small towns. That really we are great. And honestly, one of my other points here is we have mitigated all of these changes with pretty much a volunteer base, where urban areas can hire people to, manage change. In rural areas, our churches, our school boards, our clinics have been running, the boards especially, with an all-volunteer base. We do need more research on who has stayed, but really the future of our small towns is based on who will be here, not just who is here. So let's see, how are we doing on time? We got about 10 minutes. I'm going to briefly go through this future opportunities. Really, immigration is a very small part of this overall migration. So what we have found, especially in some of the prairie states, and I wouldn't speak to, say, Texas, for example, but in the Great Plains anyway, the immigrant population, the Hispanics especially, are very concentrated in certain communities. There isn't widespread Hispanic growth. There are some Hispanics, for example, moving into just about every county. But in terms of this overall migration, the immigration component of this total migration is about 5 to 6% of the total migration. What we do have here over the next 20 years is a huge opportunity because baby boomers are going to be leaving their homes in rural communities. Count up the number of homes in your community that are owned by people age 55 and over. These people are probably going to be exploring alternative housing arrangements in the next 20 years. Either they're going to find a place to move in your town, which is lower maintenance and smaller, or they're going to move to another community to find that same residential preference. But at the same time, when we saw the migration rates slow a bit in the 2000s, this is going to open up a lot of housing for potential newcomers in the next 20 years. So if there is a kind of optimal time to be working on a brain gain project, now is the time. And millennials and their life situations, of course, we hear about millennials with high student loan debt. Their home ownership rates are very low. So I think what we're going to see here is some great opportunity for those who capitalize on it. So really, I guess we've just want to open it up here. There's a landing page for all of our research. You can read all the research reports, get articles in the media that we found. At the same time, there's proceedings. There was an entire conference in Morris, Minnesota this past June that talked about this. And the fact is we don't have a good base of research in terms of strategies to attract and recruit newcomers in. We're at the point of discovery, and we would like to discover these trends with you. So again, we will make this PowerPoint available for you to give in your community if you desire to do so. And at the same time, there is an opportunity here that Community Matters has made that on November 10th from 1 to 2:30 p.m., a small number of communities will be selected by them to do some follow-up work on this recruitment and retention project. I think that's sorry, I feel like I'm rushing here. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time here. So I think we do have some questions that we're going to move forward with. Fran, are you back with us?
We do. You've done a remarkable job of really covering a lot of how do you attract some of these people, what are talking points to encourage other people to understand what you're talking about, that the message really is very positive if we look at it differently. So that was a lot of the questions are around those things. Some of the questions that came in that maybe weren't looked at were how important is easy access to nature and high-quality technology, the attraction of some of the new small-scale agriculture, despite when you say 5 to 7% of the economy is agriculture, people still think that that's a big piece and agriculture is changing. But I think it's mainly this, what are a few other things, this access to nature, high-quality technology, clearly affordability is important. Some of those key bullets that might be important to these people moving back.
Sure. So really on the nature question, yes and no. I mean, some people are just looking for a slower pace of life. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a connection to nature that brought them there. There are certainly going to be motivations by people to have that connection back in their lives or to have that connection in their lives if they don't have it. I wouldn't say it's a driving factor, but it may be part of a really plethora of reasons why people would choose to move in a rural place. I think getting away from a commute, we looked at what was called push factors and pull factors. And there were a number of push factors, in the place that they were at. But overall, it came back to a theme of kind of, life on my time. People want to dictate more about what they're doing with their life on a day-to-day basis. So, what we saw was it's not just places with the lakes, not just places with the pines. It's not just it was everywhere becomes the middle of everywhere in our small towns. I don't mean to be so generic about it, but, honestly, even in the Great Plains, in the prairie counties, we saw a significant population growth. So, initially some feedback I got, criticism I received on this was that, that's just Minnesota where you've got the lakes. And my point was, no, we see this even in the Great Plains. So on that point, and then on the technology question, especially with regards to broadband, this is interesting. I guess I've got an opinion on this. We don't have a lot of background on it. But, we didn't find that broadband was a motivating reason to bring a person to a community. And I relate it to like going to a hotel. And you look at and you're coming up on the hotel and you see a sign on the front that says color TV here. You almost expect your hotel room to have color TV. And if you walked in and they had a black and white UHF TV, you would really wonder what was going on here, and you probably wouldn't stay there again. So in many ways, I relate that to broadband. People almost assume that there's going to be some level of internet connectivity in their small towns. If they don't have it, maybe a problem as they're living there. But, not every rural area is experiencing losses. I mean, I just moved from a town in Hancock, which is the example I gave of 700 people, and I had a fiber to the home connection, a broadband connection, 20 meg down and 20 meg up. And if you know anything about upstream, that is the ability to, push your home movies to YouTube or content on the Internet. Well, I recently moved to a larger regional center of about 100,000 people, and my best Internet here is 60 meg down, so I'm faster on the downstream, but only 4.5 megabytes up. So I'm actually getting worse Internet, in my view, in this major metropolitan area than I am in the town of 700. And so, you know, we were fortunate to have a cooperative invest in running fiber to all of our rural areas and small towns. So, and that includes the open country. And the last question here is related to agriculture. We heard some evidence of people moving to either be part of a local foods kind of landscape. People really, there were some on that local food value side. And, and there were some small numbers of people who moved to engage themselves in agriculture. But again, these agricultural employment numbers are down. I mean, we've got, you know, less than 6% of the rural employment and income, even in our most rural counties in Minnesota, is tied to agriculture. A lot of people like to measure agricultural GDP, but even in the U.S., 51% of all agricultural GDP is generated in an urban area. So there is this kind of really confounding set of data to describe what ag is in our rural places. So,
sure.
So hopefully there are other questions that we've got here.
Yeah, there are a few other, and thanks for parsing that one out so well. One was, what is the racial dimension of these demographic trends? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I kind of touched on that a little bit here, but what we found is the immigrant population tends to be a very small percentage of the overall migration of people. So again, when we're talking, we're still somewhat overwhelmingly white nation, and still will be for a number of years. And when we talk about 40 to 45% of everyone moving every 5 years, again, a fraction of that is going to be related to ethnic immigration. But really what we found is it makes up a small percentage of the overall movement, and that the ethnic immigration we did find tends to be concentrated in more of the micropolitan or regional centers.
And someone asked if there's a distinction or a report that has a distinction between those micro-rural areas or micro-urban areas, as if that's what you just called it, and the rural areas. So what are where can they go for more data for rural populations? Somebody also asked about the ACS, or American Community Survey. Where can we go to get a little bit more data and maybe a distinction between the near urban and the rural?
Well, on the Brain Gain landing page, we do have our national maps inside of our reports there. You know, the micropolitan definitions come from the Bureau of the Census. So they've been analyzing migration trends quite a bit, but nobody really examines these age cohorts the way we do. So Randy Cantrell and I in Nebraska, we're constantly looking for other people to help research on this topic. I would love to say there's a plethora of resources out there, but there really aren't. With regards to reliability of data in small towns, especially places under 20,000 people. If you're trying to rely on American Community Survey data for your town of 1,000, you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding exactly what's going on because of the high margin of error that's found in that. I'm just going to leave that there. If you want to know more about the ACS problems, let me know.
and so finally, Ben, what is, you know, where can people start? What may be a very good example of a town that's recruiting, retaining, doing great stuff for this cohort? What can a town like do next week?
Yeah, so really there's the Symposium on Small Towns. We had the proceedings link on the last page of the slide there. Has a number of examples from different communities. And I just want to reiterate here, we don't have a lot of research on these retention and recruitment strategies. So, for example, a lot of the things I heard up front was all about let's offer free lots for people to move to our small town. Well, some of the research we've done in northwestern Minnesota, we polled like 47 community clerks and asked them about their incentive packages. And of those that offered free lots, about 95% of those free lots were not taken by true new people to their community. It was people in town that moved to a new lot. So in many ways, some of the strategies that people come up with just aren't research tested. But I would reiterate again that we are at the point of discovery, and we want to help shepherd other people to try things out. Honestly, the best $150 we ever spent was the community supper, and then help people think about starting nonprofits and getting trained in how to do board management. So I think there are a lot of ideas out there. We're looking to, I think with the offer here, I think you'll see in the bottom center where it says, do you want more? We'll select 4 people or 4 communities, really, for a follow-up on November 10th. And here I think I can provide you with more detailed information about your specific county and surrounding counties. And again, we want to discover what these trends are going to be. And I would love to say, again, this has been happening since 1970, but almost nobody is researching this topic. So I wish I could be pointing you to a much larger research base, but we don't have that.
Ben Winchester, thank you so much on behalf of the Orton Family Foundation, the Citizens Institute on Rural Design, and our many participants. I can't thank you enough for this enlightening, engaging presentation. It gives us all some hope. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
And thank you all for participating in this Community Matters event. Please tell us how we did today by following the survey link on your screen and or by signing up for Ben's offer. The recording of this webinar will be emailed to you and also be made available at our website, www.communitymatters.org. And we hope you join us next time. We have 2 events coming up in November. On November 5th, the Orton Family Foundation presents an introduction to its signature community development program, Community Heart and Soul. It's a field-tested approach to strengthening communities. Then on November 20th, we'll explore civic health with Dr. Mike Stout and Evan Weissman of Warm Cookies of the Revolution. Love that name, huh? Anyway, thanks again to CIRD and the Orton Family Foundation, folks who run the back room so well and make these sessions possible. Thanks for staying tuned. All the best to you and your communities. For the Orton Family Foundation, I'm Fran Stoddard. See you next time. Bye-bye.